Today we are talking about my favorite topic ever, boost. First up, turbos. So what we have here is a precision billet ball bearing 6870 turbo, and I'll explain what all that means. Billet, when we talk about billet, we talk about the compressor wheel, the cold side, the wheel that sucks in atmospheric air, compresses it, and feeds it towards the engine. Ball bearing is talking about the center section here. There's a shaft, and I'll show you here in a second, that runs through the entire turbo. That basically connects the compressor wheel and the turbine wheel. That's how they're locked together, that's how they spin at the same time. That shaft is supported by bearings. Ball bearings are the way to go. Quicker spool up, more reliability, and they can just take more abuse. So the second type of bearing is called a journal bearing. That's where the shaft will literally float in a coat of oil inside the bearing and not make any contact with anything, unlike a ball bearing. The downsides with a thrust bearing is that if you do run the engine low on oil or even out of oil, you can destroy the turbo. Obviously, if you're running the engine without oil, you got more problems. Thrust bearings, journal bearings do not withstand as much abuse as ball bearings, simply because when you create boost, specifically high boost, the actual rotating assembly of the turbo wants to push itself forward out of the turbo. That's what we call thrust. So the journal bearing has a limiting factor of how much thrust it can handle over a period of time, while ball bearings can handle way higher stress levels of thrust. I'll show you here. I'll take this thing apart. We'll take the compressor housing off. So here you got the compressor housing. You can see all those holes that were milled in to the inlet, and that is called a surge port. If you see that little groove on the inside there, that is actually to keep the turbo from surging. You know that sound that everyone loves where it goes, that's actually controlled, that's called surge. That's when air is backed up in the intake pipe and forces its way back outside the turbo. This little groove relieves that before it makes its way all the way out. It takes a lot of stress off of the compressor wheel and keeps things together for a long time. So this is the compressor housing. We'll move on to the compressor wheel itself. This is half the star of the show. The other half is this guy right here. This is the turbine wheel. This is where exhaust gases come through, spin the wheel, and get exited out the back into the downpipe. When the exhaust gases hit this wheel, it turns the shaft that's supported by the ball bearings and turns the compressor wheel. This entire rotating assembly, the exhaust side, the intake side, and the shaft that runs through the middle, all have to be perfectly balanced. I mean, down to hundredths of a gram, because if they're not, the entire rotating assembly will beat itself up and you will have a turbo failure. Lastly, turbos need to be fed. They need to be lubricated. So we have our pressurized engine oil feed in the top. It runs through the center housing and it gets gravity drained out the bottom there, out of this port. Now, oftentimes people make a lot of mistakes with this system right here. They'll mount the turbos and they'll have it clocked all weird because that's how their oil lines might fit. They can't get it perfectly straight up and down. Well, when your turbo can't drain, it backs up oil in the center cartridge. When it does that, it forces oil out of the rings on the hot and cold side. Now, fun fact, turbos do not have seals. So when your turbo's smoking, don't go running to the manufacturer and say, hey, I blew a seal. there are little rings, almost like a piston ring, that's on each end that keeps the oil inside. Now, it's not intended to keep pressurized oil in. So if you have pressurized oil in this center housing, those are going to leak and you're going to have oil consumption issues, smoke issues, so on and so forth. So it's very important that it's straight up and down because it's gravity drained. We'll put this back together here. And just like that, you got a turbo. All right, everyone, hope you enjoyed this video on turbos, superchargers, and nitrous. If you have any questions, drop a comment. See you next time.